Today's webinar is Connecting to Web Data, an introduction to Origin's Connect to Web feature. And let me do a little bit of an introduction. Of course, as you all know, being Origin users, Origin is able to import many types of data. Traditionally, we've imported them from files, either on a local disk or over a network, but it's become increasingly popular in the last few years to be able to pull data down from the internet or from a network, from a web server. So in recent versions of Origin, we've added that functionality. The functionality is part of our let me bring up and show you. It's under our data menu, and it's part of our data connector family of import routines. Data connectors are a new way to import data into Origin. Our traditional import routines. Oh, by the way, before I go any further, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A panel. I do have a colleague who's going to watch for your questions and answer them. And if I have time and I see some I can answer, I will answer. I do have someone saying they cannot hear me, but let me check something on that. Okay, I have a colleague who can hear me. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say about that. Anyway, so our traditional routines are still available in newer Origins under the import from file. Our newer data connectors are available as in connecting to file, connecting to web, and connecting to database. The difference between the two is the new data connector actually forms a link between the imported workbook and the data source, the file or the database. Instead of them being two completely separate entities, the data connector makes this lifeline between the two of them. And we have a number of data connectors actually. From CSV, Excel, JSON, you can connect other Origin files, HTML tables, HDF, and we have other third-party data connectors. What the Connect to Web does, and we'll show you in a minute, is essentially it allows you to pull that data from the internet, and it knows which data connector to use. So let's take a look at that interface. It is under Data, Connect to Web. And we have a dialog here where we can, and I'll begin to show you, I'm going to show you a few examples today, and I'm going to kind of go a little bit slowly. We're going to be very informal. But the idea is you enter a URL and you click OK, and Origin brings in the data. And we have some options here. We can include something called post data, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. We have advanced features for making advanced requests for data from the internet. And I'll show you that too. So let's start with our first example. It's going to be just importing a simple HTML table, or rather a simplish one. And before we try to work in Origin, let's copy this URL and let's put it up in a web browser and take a look at that. It's in the news, so it's COVID-19 data. And we want to find a table on here to bring in. So let me scroll down. Here's our table. Let me make my web page bigger. It's a good idea, and I'm going to do this today, to try to preview and figure out what data you want from a website, if possible, by looking at the web page. And we have a table here. This table is reported cases by country, territory, et cetera, et cetera. And we have a list of it's got the countries and various bits of data about each country. So we want to try to import this. By the way, when I look, this is data for now, I assume today. We also have data for yesterday and 2 days ago. So this one web page has incorporated 3 separate tables. The first one being today, the second one yesterday, and the third one 2 days ago. And that's important to note. And we'll note that in just a minute. So having reviewed our data online, I'm ready to come into Origin. And I'm just going to copy and paste. I've got some notes for myself about URLs and some settings. And we make these project files available after the webinar. And the notes sometimes help you guys if you use our project file. That's why the notes are there. So let me copy this URL, and I will create a new workbook. With the workbook active, the data menu is now available, and I'll go to Connect to Web. And again, that dialog I just showed you, and I can paste the URL into this dialog. And that's really all there is to it for a very basic import like we're doing. I will click OK, and Origin's going to go out and pull that HTML page from the internet, and it kind of brings it into the background, and because it is an HTML table, it is parsing out that HTML to find those tables. And this is sort of something it's important to state. When we look at a web page, let's go back a minute, I happen to know this is a real table. HTML has these things called elements, and there's a table element. That's what Origin looks for. Sometimes we have users who say, hey, your HTML import routine, it won't load this table, and they'll give us the web page. And sometimes there are things on web pages that look like tables but actually aren't tables. They visually look like one, and we can't really handle that. So I just thought I'd throw that in there in case that happens to you. Of course, you can contact us, but more likely than not, if our connector cannot see the HTML table, it really isn't a table. So let's go back to Origin, and we see we've got 3 tables listed here. And if we remember what I just talked about a minute ago, those tables for now, yesterday, and 2 days ago, these happen to be in order. I did cheat a little bit and look ahead of time before the webinar. These are in order, so I'm going to select one of these tables, the first one, double click it to add it down to my list in the lower table. And when I click OK, Origin will bring that data in. It takes a moment to pull it down and to process it. So there we have the data from that table. And it's that simple to bring in that HTML table. And that's a really simple example. So while we're here, let me show you. You can re-import the data. This created a data connector for HTML tables, and our data connectors, the actions involved with them are linked to this little icon. And if we mouse over it, we can see some information about it. We can click on that icon, and we can import the data again. We can come in, maybe change which table we want to import. Maybe we want to import that yesterday. So I'll double click there and say OK, and it'll bring in yesterday's data instead. So that's how the data connector works. Later in today's webinar, I'll show you how we can disconnect the data connector in order to manipulate our data more. All right, that's a simple example. Let's show a little less simple example, because we have to do a little bit of work after we import this table. By the way, some of my choices to pull data today may not be something that you do. They're just different examples. We're going to show some that aren't so data heavy. I'll show you a more data heavy example a little bit later in the webinar. So let me just copy this. And go to my web browser and bring this in. It's a Wikipedia page on chemical elements. I needed to find a good table, and this was a good one. And if we scroll to the bottom of the page, there's a lot of information here. Periodic table, much information, little tables everywhere. But I want to bring in this very last one, this list of the chemical elements with their properties. This is the one I'm going to pull into Origin. And it's rather long, and it looks like we maybe have a couple tables after that. So we do have one large table that we want to keep an eye out for. It's got maybe around 118, 120 rows. All right, I'll get that URL, copy it, create a workbook, data, connect to web. Paste that URL. I'll get a little preview. By the way, you actually can embed LabTalk values into a URL. I should have shown that today, but I'm not going to. So you can make these dynamic URLs based on, for example, date periods. I'll show you at the very end of the webinar. I guess I can show you an example of how that was used. But I'll go ahead and click OK. And I don't know why it's saying it's an invalid URL. Oh, I know. That is a good point right there. Let me come in and triple click there. This is actually a very good error to have because something I can point out to you. What happened is there is actually a space character at the beginning. I did not see that. So when I tried to make that request, Origin said it was invalid. Maybe it should not have dismissed the dialog, but it did. So I'll paste it again. And that's a lot of what happens. Sometimes you'll get an error, and it can be something as simple as a space character at the beginning or a space character at the end. And I happen to notice there's a space character here. So I'll just delete it. And then when I click OK, I get the data. Actually, I get to choose my tables. And we can see we have a large number of tables associated with this Wikipedia page. And somewhat here we have to use our intuition about which is the right one. And you know, clearly these tables that are 2 by 1 aren't legitimate. We have to come down our list and find one that could be legitimate. We have one large one here, number 12. That's got 13 by 123 rows. And we have a larger one, but we know it can't be this first table. It is going to be the 12th table, the one with 13 columns and 123 rows. So I'll double click on it, bring it down to that bottom list and click OK. Origin brings in the data now. We need to do a little bit of work on it. It's not ready to go yet. Origin does a pretty good job of parsing those tables, but it's not always perfect. So let's do a little bit of cleanup. First, let's look at our column long name. It's just this repeated list of chemical element. That phrase repeated over and over again. So I want to go ahead and clear that because I don't need that. And I've actually have my long name in the units row and I have my units down in the data. So let's move things around. I will select that long name row. I can click on this row header, right click and choose clear. Then this is a nifty trick not many people know, but it's very useful. I can select the units row, right click, come down and choose set as long name. It'll promote those values from the units row to the long name. Now, if we look down in the data, we do have some units here. There appears to be some kind of bad HTML that slipped through. We'll ignore that, but we do have some units in this data row actually. So I'll select the data row and choose set as units. So that's what we looked at our page, we found the table we wanted, we brought it in, we selected it after kind of having to use our intuition over which is the correct table to choose. And then we did our cleanup by moving our label rows up, you know, moving that what was units to the long name and moving the units out of the data. And now we have data to work with. If you will give me just a minute, I do have a question by a user, and I think I'll let my colleague, they have a question about importing a URL into Origin. Either my colleague will be able to help you with that, or we will take a look at the end of the webinar. We'll have some time for some questions then. And let me move on to our next topic. And we may repeat ourselves a little bit today. That's okay. It's about showing you what's available and doing some learning. Now we have an Origin connector via the web. We have one of our data connectors lets you connect your current Origin project with another Origin project and pull data out of that Origin project. With the Connect to Web, you can actually pull data out of an Origin project that's out on the internet. And we have one on, we have it hosted on our website right now. And this is the URL. And you'll observe that at the end of the URL, I have a file name with a .opju. So let me copy this URL. Create a new workbook. We have to have that workbook as a data container for the data connector. Go to Data, Connect to Web, add my URL, and click OK. And when I do that, it brings down the project file for us to select from. This is a sample project that ships with Origin. It's the data used for our tutorials. It's a convenient Origin project. That's why I'm using it today. And we have different options for matrix books, for worksheets. And you'll see for this Origin connector, it's telling us what's a folder, what's a workbook, what's a individual worksheet. And I'm just looking for a particular worksheet. Let's look at a worksheet for, how about some dose response no inhibitor data. So I'll double click on that. We get to see a little preview of the columns, and we've added it to our import list. And then when I click OK, Origin brings in that data. So that's our Origin connector. We can bring in, I'm fairly sure we can change our data by going to our data connector icon and clicking on it and choosing select. And maybe we want to bring in a different data. Maybe we want to bring in, I think we can do this. I'm going to select this sensor data instead and say OK. And see it brought in a different set of data. So that's our Origin connector. And naturally, too, I might as well say this, you can also do that with a local file, by the way, going to connect to file. We have an Origin file connector there. That way you can do the same thing. Instead of connecting across the internet, you can connect either locally or to a file on your local area network. All right, let's see. Do we have any questions? We have the one about the URL, and we'll take a look at that, I think, after the end of the webinar. That may be interesting to diagnose that. All right, let's move on to our next subject. We're going to look at JSON arrays. All right, one of the things to know is that data, naturally, as you know, data comes in different formats. Traditionally, in Origin, we for our text-based formats, either a TXT file or a CSV file or a DAT file, it's column row data in a form of text. And of course, we know that there are binary third-party files, like let me think, like an SPC file, an HDF5 file, et cetera, et cetera. But there are some newer technologies that have become more prevalent with the rise of the internet. One of them is XML. It was actually, I guess, there technically before the internet came along. It was it's a text-based way of interchanging data. It's like a standard format. But an even newer one is called JSON. It means JavaScript Object Notation. It's a hierarchical, how shall I say it? It's text-based, but it's based on this hierarchical structure, and it's sort of follows this code of keys and values. And on this example, we're going to actually look at something that's called a web service. I don't know if you're familiar with this term or not, but web services are essentially some sort of service that a company or an institution or an organization sets up to publish and make their data accessible, either publicly or privately, perhaps openly and free, or pay per use. Some companies have internal web services for serving their data on internal web servers, or what some people call application servers. Let's take a quick look at this one web service. I'm going to copy this URL and bring it into my web browser. This is a chemistry and cheminformatics web service site. It was created by a university in the United Kingdom. And typically when you have a web service, they're going to publish documentation about how it works. And most of these web services, they build on that URL. They make that URL, well, they break it down into parts, and those parts can be parsed into meanings, into queries for you to bring in data. So if you run into where you need to pull data from a web service, one of the first things you need to do is kind of understand the docs, read them, find what you want, understand. Most of them will give you an example to play with. So let's look at this one, and I'm going to choose the simplest example. We want to use their data web service. So I'm going to click on the docs and take a look. And in this case, they have a number of options available for what kinds of data they can pull. This is sort of a click on to expand. Many of this web service offers a large number of drug-based data, molecule data, mechanisms, metabolism data. I'm just going to choose the simplest one first. It's at the top. It says activity. This activity request. And the idea is you're building a URL. And when we look, it kind of gives us what we call a schema. This is parts of the URL that are going to get broken down so that the web server that's listening for your request knows what to give you. In this case, it gives us a chance to look at our preview, and I'm going to choose a JSON preview here. I'll click on Get, and it's going to show us a rough idea of what we get back. And this is a little preview of that JSON. So I want to use that URL, and I happen to have that URL handy already. I found it, and this is it. Our URL. I had to add, in order to get that JSON format, I had to manually add what's called a query variable at the very end of my URL. This is a URL for my data, the first part. And then I had to actually, this took me a few minutes to deduce from the documentation, because for that particular web service, some of the documentation is a little too general. I had to deduce that I had to add this. This was called a query string at the end to tell it that I wanted the JSON data. And that happens sometimes with web services. Sometimes, all right, let me show you what we'll do. We'll take this whole URL and we'll come back to our web browser. And this is an important point. I can come in and put my request into the web browser and look and see what it brings back. And we can see the JSON, it brings back this hierarchical data. And if we scroll down, using your web browser to preview your data to understand what you're going to get is a very important tool to have when you are working with web data. I'm going to scroll down and look. It looks like I've got this repeating structure. Well, maybe it's I don't know what it is. It's different assays. It's different. Maybe it's different compounds. But I've got sort of this 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's like it's essentially an array of these chunks of information. So I've looked at that and I kind of understand what I'm looking for. So we can come now into Origin, create a workbook, go to Data, connect to Web. And it's another simple one. We'll have a little more complex request here in a few minutes. These are still simple requests. And okay, we're good. So let's click OK. Origin went out to get that data, and now let's come back. We have to choose what part of this data we want to import. And remember, if you remember, we just looked in our web browser. We looked at how that's structured. We found what we think are an array of chunks of data. And indeed, here we see this in Origin. We see that 0, 1, 2, 3, and it looks like that is organized. So each of these objects is like a row, and we have data. We have these properties, which are kind of columns, I'm sure. So let's bring those in, and I'll do that by going at the next higher level than this array, up at activities, and I'll double click it to bring it down into my table of selected items to import. And I'll click OK. And Origin will bring that in. We see in the report sheet what we have. It's just, this is some sort of activities assays. I chose this. I made this choice because to show a web service and to show a variety of options we have available. If you'll remember correctly, we can go in and we could, if we wanted to, if we imported it came time to choose which data to bring in, maybe if we chose the wrong thing, all we have to do is click on that data connector icon and go back to select, and we can change our selection if we need to. You're not stuck. If you make a mistake, you can go back through that data connector icon. So that's using JSON data. It's another data form. And at the end of the webinar, when I show you some fun examples that we put together, there's another couple of them that use the JSON. All right, let's take a look at, let's get a little bit more involved, and we're going to look at, once you get this data into Origin, what can you do with it? And I again have some COVID-19 data. It's a complex URL. Let me copy that. We'll take a look at our web browser to get an idea of what we're looking at. This is some COVID-19 data. I can deduce from the URL here, it's a time series. It's confirmed cases in the United States. It doesn't look like much here, but it does look like it's some sort of, it is text data. If it doesn't render real well in the web page, you can actually look at the raw data behind it too by right-clicking in that page and doing View Page Source. And when we look at what we're going to get, this is CSV data clearly. If I look at the top, I have some column headers, and then I have rows and columns of data. So we're bringing in CSV data. All right, let's create a workbook. And ultimately what we're going to do with this data, before I bring it in, we're going to bring in this data and we're going to transform it. And we're going to look at a graph of some trends. So data, connect to web, paste my URL, and click OK. All right, this brings up in one of our new data connectors, our CSV data connector, we get a little dialog where we get to decide if we have row headers, column headers, how to handle them. When I looked at my data, when I previewed it in the web browser, I observed that I did have some column long names, or what we'll use for long names. So we're gonna go ahead and keep this check that data has column name. And I'll click OK. Our data came in. We have some codes. We're mainly interested, what we want to do is we want to look at it on a per US state basis. And we see we have a province state column. And then as we go out, we begin to see we have one column per day. And I'm interested in reducing this data and converting it. So let's see what we can do. If you'll remember correctly, I said earlier, we don't have to keep connected. We can disconnect this data connector. And I'm going to do that right now, because when you use a data connector, this worksheet is locked. You can't change this data or rearrange it. It's locked so it's able to bring back the data. I'll go to this data connector, click on it, and choose just Remove Data Connector. This frees the data up in this worksheet for me to manipulate it. And the first thing I want to do, I want to get rid of some of these extra columns. Like I said, I basically need the state column and the date columns. So let's get rid of these at the beginning. We don't need them. We can get rid of these too. And now we're left with the states and the dates. But when we look at our data, the original data was actually for like municipalities, city, state, city, state. And so I've got the same state listed multiple times, and I want to reduce that so I only have one row per state. And the way I'll do that is from our worksheet menu. If you'll hold on just a minute. I'll go to worksheet, remove combine duplicated rows. And I need a reference column. What column am I going to use to decide duplicates? So I'll click on my flyout tool, my flyout button, and choose the state province. And how do I want to merge these duplicated rows? So I have options about what values to use. I'm going to choose the sum for each of these date columns. I'm going to choose the sum of each state. And I have some choices. Do I want to output to the same worksheet? It's a destructive way, but that's okay. Or do I want to put it out to a new worksheet or a new workbook? Let's just go ahead and put it in the same worksheet since we won't need to go back with the data. Okay, so we see that we've been reduced down to just some states, a single row for state and territory. Now what I want to do is this isn't really a usable or manageable format, having these days as a column each. I want to transpose this data so that my states are the columns and my dates are the rows. And we can do that from the worksheet menu. Transpose. And there's a little trick here that we have to pay attention to. I made this mistake when I was going through this prior to the webinar. It's one you have to be careful of. First, we're not going to worry about recalculating. We just want to make this transpose and go on with life. We don't need to worry about it recalculating. What we want to do, and it's already checked, exchange label with data. Our label being the dates and our data being the state names. What label type are we going to exchange? And that is long name. What is the data we're going to exchange? It's in the first column. And I'm going to, this time, rather than transposing directly into the same sheet, I'm going to choose a new sheet and click OK. All right, so we've done that transposition. We have dates as rows now and states as columns. To make this usable, we have to do a couple other things. Our dates are left aligned here. That means Origin is not treating them as a date. It's treating them as pieces of text. It won't graph them properly. You wouldn't be able to do any calculations on them properly. Let's convert these text dates to a real date format Origin can use. And the way we do that is to double click on the column header to open the column properties dialog. And we want to come down to the format. And right now it's the default format, which is text and numeric. And we want to change this to date. And when we do, we have a display format we have to choose from. This format will also help Origin know how to parse those. It's got to parse those text representative of dates to figure it out. We can keep this format. This works. Even though there's a 4-digit year here, it's going to figure out that 2-digit year. And I'll just say, okay. Origin managed. Now you see that those dates are right aligned. That means Origin's really going to treat them like date data. And there's one other thing we need to do. If we're going to do any graphing on this, we have our y-axes. We have states for the y-axes, the state columns, but we don't have an x-axis. But we want to make these dates our x-axis. And this is a quick way to do this. I will select the column. And if you follow my mouse, oh, wait, we have our mini toolbar. Let me trigger that again. From our mini toolbar, we can change it to an X column. Now that we have our data in a graphable form, let's use one of Origin 2020B's new graph types to graph this to show trends. I'm going to select the entire worksheet by clicking on this upper left cell and go to Plot, Browser, and choose a Color Lines Browser Plot. And when I do that, I need to do a couple things. I need to set the auto rescale to Y. And when I do that, it's a type of graph that lets me plot multiple columns and look at them at one time. On the left side, I have a list of data sets to look at trends. And as we go down our states, we can see the trend based on based on date. And as we know right now, what's going on in the United States is some areas of the southern and western part of our country are experiencing pretty severe increases in incidence of the virus, whereas other places, for example, in the Northeast or the New England, where I and my colleagues live, we're experiencing, reduced numbers. So let's take a look. All right, let's start with New York. That's kind of been the big story in the United States for many months. We can plot New York, and I can hold down the control key. Let's take a look. We can see that New York's sort of leveling off recently. Let's go to Massachusetts, where our OriginLab headquarters are. I added Mass. Let's go and look. Hey, why don't we look at Vermont? I live in Vermont, the state of Vermont. And we don't have any cases in Vermont, but what we can see in these states, the leveling off of the trend. But let's look at some of the other states where we're seeing issues, like Arizona. Arizona is coming up, and we're seeing an increase, or Texas, where there are a lot of problems. So we took that data. This is just I didn't want to get into discussing the pandemic too much, but my point was I went from pulling data from the internet, I brought it in, I disconnected that data connector, I reduced the data, and then I transposed it, and I was able to use our browser graph to look at trends. So we have multiple steps we can do there. Now let's look at a little more complex request, a post request. And let me explain the different types of requests. All right. When you make a request to the internet, whether it be from Origin's Connect to Web or on a web browser, you get a URL. Let me clean up my tabs a little bit. We'll come over here and look at our OriginLab homepage. We have a URL here. We're mostly all familiar with URLs. Well, behind that URL, there is a technology called HTTP. It is the protocol that allows data to be passed around the internet, or a network for that matter. It's just what's called a protocol. And there are different ways you can pass data around. There are HTTP request types. And the two main ones, one is called a GET request, and the other is called a POST request. A typical web page is a GET request. It is saying, get this data for me and bring it back. A POST request is similar. It has a URL. It's going to make a request of a web server, but it's also going to send a packet of information to that web server. So it is posting data to that web server, and the web server can do whatever it wants with that data, but there is that little extra package of data that goes with a GET request. Everything is self-contained in the URL. With a POST, you have a URL and some baggage. So we've been doing GET requests so far on Origin. They've all been GET requests. Let's look at a POST request, and this is another web service. It's PubChem. And let's look at what's involved in making a POST request to this PubChem web service. I went through, they've got excellent documentation. Just give it a minute to load. They have excellent very considerable documentation. By the way, I'll come back to this, but if I scroll to the top, the PubChem calls this, and this technology, this whole web service thing, is based on something called REST. You don't need to know this, but if you'll hold on just a minute, I need a sip of water. Okay, thank you for holding. All right, it's based on a term called REST. It just means representative state transfer. It's just a way, it's the umbrella that web services operate under. Let me come back and look. I'm looking at the docs on what's involved in this POST request. We need a request body request. And we go through, and it's going to give us a URL. This is for testing, and I'm going to use this URL. That's our get part. But it's also telling me I can enter the CID equals 1, 2, 3 as a quote unquote post body. So let's incorporate that into Origin and look at this request. By the way, we also have to do what's called adding a request header. It's telling me to add a content type. Okay, it's adding us to add a content type. So we're going to need to do that. And I'm going to copy my URL because it's mighty long. By the way, this will be, if we look at the end of the URL, this will be CSV data. If you have a choice when you're connecting to a website of all the different data types to connect to the web and pull in, we suggest you use CSV data because it most closely resembles the worksheet rows and columns structure. So I've copied my URL, create a workbook, data, connect to web, and I'm going to, since I'm going to have a post body and I need to add some headers, I am going to make an advanced request. And just you can divide your URL into parts. For example, we talked about a few minutes ago, we talked about how different parts of a URL can build a query. You can divide that up in this part of the dialog. We don't really need to. We can just paste our whole URL. We do have some post data. Let me move my dialog and look. It needs to be CID equals a number of numbers. So I'll do post, and I want our CIDs, they're chemical, they're compound IDs. And let's just choose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's our little packet of information, that tidbit of text. Now we need to add a request header. And it's going to be content type. Do we have a content type? No, I need to create a custom one. So I'm going to add a custom one and call it content type. And it needs to be x form URL encoded. I don't expect you to remember that. X form means form URL encoded. Form URL encoded. Now, the thing with these request headers, you may have a web service that needs what's called an authentication token, some way to identify you, and many web services expect you to put that authentication token into what's called a request header. So you may have to come in here, define a custom header, and then put your auth token in there. Let's click OK, and we'll come in. I'm not sure. Forbidden. I don't quite know why. We'll come back in. I think we can ignore that. That request header actually. Let's come back to connect to web. Bring in our URL, post data, and I can just say CID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sometimes you will see that there will be errors, and sometimes web services are even down. Let's click OK now. Oh, it did come in. Remember, we specified we wanted CSV data. I don't know if it has a column name or not. I should have previewed it, but I didn't. And I come in, and it's just a simple table for these compounds of molecular formats and molecular weights. But that shows us the whole idea of the post. We come in. Let's look real quick again. Data, connect to web. We have that URL. And this is where we're adding, when you're requested to, you're supposed to add that post data. This is going to be where we put that packet in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this can be basically any arbitrary text that your web service wants. They'll tell you how they want this to look. By the way, So you know about this. There's also a checkbox at the bottom. Accept self-signed or invalid SSL certificates. SSL is a way. It is a way for a client such as Origin and a server such as a web server to encrypt a connection between the two. And generally, these SSL uses these certificates, and these certificates are created by what's called trusted authorities out on the internet. They're companies or organizations that everyone trusts with these encryption keys. But some organizations, if you have an internal web server, if you have an intranet server, you may also use this SSL for your internal communications. And sometimes you can create your own certificates. Well, by default, the mechanism, the Windows HTTP mechanism that runs behind the scenes for Origin, it does not like those self-signed certificates. And you have to say, no, you accept those for this request. So in that case, if that goes on with you, then you just need to check this right here, if that's the case in your case. So let's just say okay and bring that data in again. All right, so we looked at the more complex post requests. Now let's look at, I think we're done with the new part of the webinar. Let's see how we're doing for questions. We do have that one question about that URL that doesn't work, so bear with me for just a moment. All right, we're going to take a look at the final part here. Let's look at just a couple of the fun examples we put together, some of the creative examples of using Connect to Web. And we'll go to our Learning Center. If you're not familiar with Learning Center, it's a dialogue in Origin. Origin ships with a whole bunch of example projects, like graph examples. Let me clear out. I did a search earlier. I remembered my search for radar plots. For example, we have a large number of graph samples that you can open up and see how they were built. And then we have analysis samples, including on many topics, including statistics. Our statistics examples are very good from Learning Center. I'm weak on statistics; it's not my area of expertise. So even I come here to learn up on a specific statistics analysis. So that's a great place to come. But under our general analysis, we have a couple of examples. The first one is earthquakes, which uses our JSON connector via the internet and generates an HTML report. So I'll double click on that example. The project loads up. It's going to take a moment. And it says, hey, do you want to import last week's data? And I'll say, okay, and Origin is kicking in with those HTTP requests behind the scenes, and it's going to take a minute to do a couple. It brought in data, and we created a very nice looking HTML report of the global map of the earthquakes from last week and the top 10 quakes. HTML reports, by the way, we did a webinar on this a couple weeks ago. And we do have a recording of it. They're a great new way to make reports in Origin. Long story short, you can use HTML or markup to make a more attractive report than you could previously in Origin. And let's look at one more example. Let's go to Help, Learning Center. And this is a fun little example that my colleague put together. It is an interactive flights over New York City graph. It will make a request that gets refreshed every few seconds. Let me start it. And it takes a few seconds to get going. I think it does the request about every 5 seconds. And at some point soon, we'll begin to see these flights move around. We'll see if we can get this going. There we go. It's a little hard to see, but they're moving around. Origin internally, every 5 seconds or so, is going out there and pulling new data from that flight information online database. And I'll stop that. I think that's going to wrap things up generally today. I hope that you enjoyed and you learned a little bit about Connect to Web.